Have you ever stopped to consider the sheer magnitude of the American Civil War? Imagine a young country barely a century old, torn asunder by an ideological chasm. On one side, the North, industrial and forward-looking, held firm in its conviction that slavery, the abhorrent institution that chained millions, must be abolished. On the other side, the South, agrarian and traditional, clung to a way of life built on the backs of these enslaved individuals. In the years leading up to the war, the tension simmered, stoked by fiery debates and controversial legislation. Key figures emerged, each staking their claim on the nation's future. Abraham Lincoln, a steadfast beacon of abolitionism. Jefferson Davis, a staunch defender of the Southern cause, and countless others, their voices echoing in the chambers of power, heralding the coming storm. As the political climate grew increasingly volatile, it became clear that compromise was no longer an option. The stage was set for a conflict that would shape the destiny of a nation. The first significant land battle of the Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run, was a shocking wake-up call. On a hot summer day, July 21, 1861, in the state of Virginia, the clashing of Union and Confederate forces marked the harsh reality of the conflict that had just begun. Both sides, brimming with youthful enthusiasm and patriotic fervor, found themselves woefully unprepared for the grim realities of war. The day ended with a surprising Confederate victory, shattering the Union's hope for a swift resolution. Instead, it became brutally clear that the war was not going to end quickly or easily. The aftermath of the battle left the fields of Bull Run stained with the blood of thousands, a chilling testament to the brutal nature of civil war. The First Battle of Bull Run was a sobering experience for both sides, a stark reminder of the cost of war. Fought on September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam was one of the bloodiest single-day battles in American history. It unfolded in the fields and forests of Maryland, a border state caught in the crossfire. Both the Union and the Confederacy employed strategies that led to high casualties, in a desperate bid to gain the upper hand. The Confederates, led by General Robert E. Lee, were aiming to carry the war into Union territory. The Union forces under General George McClellan were determined to stop this advance. The day ended with over 22,000 casualties, a sobering reminder of the cost of war. This battle, however, had far-reaching implications. It halted the Confederates' first invasion of the North and gave President Abraham Lincoln the victory he needed to announce the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This shifted the focus of the Civil War from a battle over secession to a battle for freedom. The Battle of Antietam was a turning point, shifting the focus of the war to the issue of slavery. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863, is often considered the war's turning point. Over 3 grueling days, the Union and Confederate forces clashed in brutal combat. The Union's successful defense was a pivotal moment, as they held their ground against a relentless Confederate assault. Key to their victory was Cemetery Hill, where Union soldiers stood firm against the Confederate onslaught, turning the tide of the battle. Yet the cost was high. The battle witnessed one of the highest numbers of casualties in the Civil War, a grim testament to its ferocity. This battle also marked the Confederacy's last major offensive operation in the North. Despite their initial victories, the Confederate forces failed to break the Union's defenses, marking a shift in momentum in favor of the Union. Gettysburg was a significant Union victory and marked a turning point in the Civil War. The Siege of Vicksburg, lasting from May 18 to July 4, 1863, was another critical moment in the Civil War. Situated on the Mississippi River, Vicksburg was a strategic stronghold. Its capture by the Union would effectively split the Confederacy in two, severing the vital supply lines that ran along the river. General Ulysses S. Grant led his Union forces in a grueling 47-day siege that tested the mettle of both sides. The city's fall on July 4th marked not just a military victory but a psychological one. The Union's triumph shattered the morale of the Confederacy while boosting the spirits of the Union. The people of the North celebrated, seeing a light at the end of the long, dark tunnel of war. It was a turning point that would lead to further Union victories. The Siege of Vicksburg was a decisive victory for the Union, further turning the tide in their favor. As the war dragged on, the Confederacy found itself increasingly cornered and desperate. In the final stages of the Civil War, the Union forces continued to tighten their grip, putting the Confederacy in a precarious position. One of the most significant events during this time was the fall of Richmond, Virginia. Richmond was not just any city, It was the Confederate capital. The loss of Richmond in April 1865 was a devastating blow, signaling that the end was near for the Confederacy. The Union forces, under the command of Ulysses S. Grant, continued their relentless pursuit, cornering the remaining Confederate forces at Appomattox Courthouse. Here, on April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee made the difficult decision to surrender. Lee's surrender marked the effective end of the Civil War, a conflict that had raged for 4 long years and claimed the lives of over 600,000 Americans. However, the nation's struggles were far from over. Just days after the surrender at Appomattox, the country was dealt another blow: the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, who had guided the nation through the tumultuous war years, was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Lincoln's untimely death sent shockwaves through a nation that was just beginning to heal from the wounds of war. In the wake of Lincoln's death, the task of Reconstruction fell to his Vice President Andrew Johnson. Johnson faced the daunting task of reconciling the North and South and rebuilding a nation torn apart by war, but that's a story for another time. The Civil War was a defining moment in American history, a brutal conflict that forever shaped the nation's future. It was a time of profound change and upheaval, a time that tested the mettle of the American people. But from the ashes of this conflict, a new nation would emerge, forever changed by the trials and tribulations of the Civil War. The American Civil War was a complex and tragic chapter in our history, but it was also a time of great change and progress. This conflict, which divided families and claimed countless lives, was a catalyst that ultimately reshaped the nation. The war resulted in the abolition of slavery, a dark institution that had cast a long shadow over the United States since its inception. This was a significant turning point, a beacon of progress amidst the chaos. The Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863 declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be set free. This was a bold statement, a promise of freedom that reverberated across the battlefields and beyond. Following the war, the United States entered a period known as Reconstruction. This was a time of rebuilding, not just in terms of infrastructure, but also societal norms and laws. The nation grappled with the challenge of integrating millions of newly freed individuals into society. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed during this period, granting former slaves citizenship and the right to vote. Yet the struggle for civil rights did not end with these amendments. It was, and still is, an ongoing battle. The Civil War may have legally ended slavery, but it did not eradicate racism or systemic inequality. It was merely the beginning of a long journey towards true equality, a journey that we as a nation are still on today. As we reflect on the Civil War, we must remember that it was more than just a series of battles. It was a pivotal moment in our history, a time of profound change and transformation. The war tested the resilience of the American spirit and laid the groundwork for the democratic ideals we continue to strive for. Despite the pain and suffering, the Civil War was a catalyst for change, setting the stage for the nation we know today.